Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today we're going over the news that Dan Osborn, the independent candidate who ran for Senate in 2024 in the state of Nebraska, has formed an exploratory committee for a potential run against Senator Pete Ricketts in 2026. So this is how the article begins. In Omaha, Nebraska, Dan Osborn, a decades-long independent, is forming an exploratory committee for another U.S. Senate run. Osborn, who just recently lost against Republican Deb Fischer in the November election, said in a statement Thursday that he'd be campaigning against Republican Senator Pete Ricketts if he runs. 2 years ago, I was an unknown union mechanic in Nebraska, then I ran for U.S. Senate. We shocked everyone and got 47%, Osborn said. Multi-billionaire Pete Ricketts is Nebraska's other senator. He's up next year. We could replace a billionaire with a mechanic. That's a tweet that Dan Osborn put out on X going over that statement. Ricketts has held the seat since 2023 when he was appointed by Nebraska Governor Jim Pillen to fill the vacancy created by Ben Sasse stepping down. Ricketts then defeated Democrat Preston Love Jr. in a special election in November of 2024. Ricketts is expected to run for his first full term next year. He has not yet responded to Osborn's announcement. Osborn, a steam fitter and industrial mechanic, helped preserve nearly 500 jobs in Nebraska during the Kellogg strike. And that's the end of the article here. So this is a very, very interesting situation. For one, you may think, well, it's the state of Nebraska. How competitive could Nebraska really be? Well, in the 2024 presidential race, Donald Trump won the state of Nebraska by 20.5 points, 20.5 points at the presidential race. It is split up by congressional district for the electoral vote, so 2 votes go to the overall winner, and then 1 electoral vote for each congressional race. Nebraska's second congressional race district actually did vote for Kamala Harris by 4.7%. So Nebraska did give one of its electoral votes to Harris in 2024. But the Senate level, things have been a different story. Just going back in Nebraska, let's just go back to say 2016 and work our way up from there. 2018, Deb Fischer won by 19.1%, a safe Republican win. 2020, Ben Sasse won by 38.3%. 2022, there was no Senate race, and then comes 2024, where it was expected that Nebraska would have 2 safe Republican Senate seats once again. Pete Ricketts won his special election against his Democratic opponent by 25.2%. But Republican Senator Deb Fischer was actually facing a surprisingly tough fight from independent candidate Dan Osborn, who things were getting very, very close in the polls leading up to the final days of the election, where Deb Fischer ended up winning by only 6.7% over Dan Osborn. In fact, I'm going to show you what the polls were leading up to this election. So for the predictions for this race, the Cook Political Report had it listed as lean Republican, as did Inside Elections and Sabato's Crystal Ball. Decision Desk HQ and The Hill had it likely Republican, Elections Daily, likely Republican, Real Clear Politics, lean, and 538 likely. So this is something you'd see out of a more like a toss-up state rather than the state of Nebraska. But when you look at the polling averages, 538 only had Deb Fischer leading Dan Osborn by about 2.4% in the final polling averages. The Decision Desk HQ had Fischer leading by 1.3, and Race to the White House had Fischer up by 1, an average of 1.6% favorability for Fischer. Again, in Nebraska, this was a safe Republican state that really should never have been too competitive. But there were some polls in the final months of the campaign that actually showed Osborn leading. A New York Times Siena College poll had Osborn leading by about 1 point, as did Change Research. The Economist YouGov poll did show Fischer leading by about 7, and Torchlight Strategies by 7 in the final 2 polls, or one of the final 3 polls that were conducted. But this race showed it was going to be very, very close leading into Election Day. And then what ended up happening? It ended up being a very close race. Deb Fischer ended up winning by 6.7%, a likely Republican margin, but in the safe red state of Nebraska, where Donald Trump won by over 20 points, and where Pete Ricketts won by over 25 points, it ended up being a likely Republican win. The question will be, was that more attributed to Deb Fischer being a weak Republican candidate, or Eric Osborn being a strong independent candidate? Well, that's going to be a very big question for 2026 now. Because as Dan Osborn formed a exploratory committee, it's looking more and more likely that it's going to be Pete Ricketts versus Osborn yet again. And the Democrats, like they did last time around, where it may mention this in the article in the Wikipedia, that due to Dan Osborn's independent candidacy, the Nebraska Democratic Party had originally not intended to field a candidate and planned to endorse Osborn on May 18th. However, on May 15th, Osborn stated that he would not accept the help of any political party. This led to a condemnation by the state party chair, Jane Klebe, who said that Osborn had previously promised to work with them in exchange for them not running a candidate. Due to Osborn's announcement taking place the day after the state's primary, Klebe announced they would be looking for a write-in candidate to run under the party banner in November. However, they ultimately decided not to run a write-in candidate. So things were not all rosy between the Democrats in Nebraska and Dan Osborn, but I think the Democrats in Nebraska also know a Democrat's not going to win the state of Nebraska statewide in a Senate race. And even if there is some burned bridges with Osborn, he still likely presents the Democrats' best chance in the state of Nebraska of electing a non-Republican would be the independent Osborn. But the question will be for 2026, does Osborn actually have a chance against Pete Ricketts? Because Ricketts just won by 25.2%, which is bigger than when Deb Fischer was reelected in 2018 by 19.1%. 2018 was also a very good night for the Democrats, and she still won by 19 points. But does Osborn actually pose a legitimate threat to Ricketts? And, it's going to be a good question because right now, Dan Osborn, as I mentioned, is the best non-Republican opponent in the state of Nebraska for the Democrats or independents to possibly run. The question will be, though, Pete Ricketts, who just won by 25.2%, would Osborn's candidacy bring Ricketts down to the 6.7% level that Deb Fischer got? That I'm a little bit skeptical of, because Ricketts, I think, is more popular than Deb Fischer, and I think he would perform better than Fischer did. But does that mean Osborn could at least make this race more competitive? And that's where I think the conversation really starts to begin. Looking at the 2026 Senate map right now, I have about, this is from the last video I did on New Hampshire, I have about 5 Senate races that are looking at to be toss-ups or battlegrounds. Nebraska, I do not consider to be one of them. But let's just say hypothetically, President Trump and the Trump administration are viewed really negatively going into 2026. The polls are looking great for the Democrats. Is it possible there's so much of an anti-Republican sentiment that maybe Dan Osborn can get some momentum in the state of Nebraska? Maybe this race moves down to likely Republican, and if things got really so bad, like the Republicans are doing terrible everywhere, maybe it could fall to lean Republican. I certainly would not bet on lean Republican happening, but could Osborn do well enough that it goes down to likely Republican? I think at very least it's realistic, because we just saw an election in Nebraska that was settled by 6.7%. Now, I don't think Osborn, in all honesty, is going to do as well as he did against Deb Fischer. I think Pete Ricketts did much better in that special election against a Democrat, so maybe the fact that it's an independent, not a Democrat, will give Osborn a boost, which I think it will. I doubt the 6.7% that Fischer did to Osborn is going to happen again. I think Ricketts is in a stronger position than Fischer was, but I think Nebraska falling under a 15% margin of victory and being put into likely Republican column, I think at very least is certainly possible. And I honestly think, looking at this from the side of Osborn, obviously he wants to run and become a senator. On the political strategy aspect of it, the Democrats probably are thrilled with this news, which is why I think you won't see a Democrat run for this race. Because the Democrats are looking at the Senate map in 2026, and they would look at Michigan, New Hampshire, Maine, North Carolina, and Georgia. These are the 5 states that are really, really competitive. And if Democrats want to be able to pick up enough seats to flip the Senate, they would have to win all 5 of these seats, and they'd still be down 51-49, and J.D. Vance would break the tie at 50-50. So for the Democrats to win the Senate, they need, honestly, every seat they can get. And I don't think we're going to see Nebraska go blue. I really don't, or go independent. But what if Nebraska gets so close again, Republicans have to pour in money and resources to help out Ricketts in Nebraska? This is what happened with Osborn in 2024. Well, that may give the Democrats a little bit of more money and more spending to go after states like Michigan, North Carolina, Georgia, New Hampshire, and Maine. And maybe, if President Trump is doing bad enough, maybe be able to win all 5 of them. It's certainly not unrealistic. I don't think all 5 will go to the Democrats, but I don't think it's impossible that they do. Maine, with Susan Collins, a Republican, Maine's a likely Democratic state at the presidential level. North Carolina is always a toss-up state at the presidential level. Very, very close election, possible Democratic former governor running. That state can go blue as well. And then Michigan, New Hampshire, and Georgia are 3 Democratic defending seats that could stay blue. Well then, Nebraska could take a little bit of attention away from the Republicans in defending these seats just a bit in terms of money, or they have to defend Nebraska. maybe that opens the Democrats up to trying to contest Iowa or Ohio or Alaska, none of which I expect to go blue, but it sets the Democrats up for a better future election in 2028. This is all, I think, what would be considered a Democratic pipe dream. In all honesty, I think Nebraska stays solid Republican, and Republicans, I don't think are going to lose all 5 of these Senate races, to be honest. But trying to forecast what 2026 will look like now is kind of tricky because obviously we have like a year and a half or a year and a quarter until things really pick up for 2026 in the Senate election. So things could really change a lot in the next few months. But right now, I think at very least, Osborn presents a very interesting dynamic and development in the state of Nebraska, one that Republicans and independents and Democrats in the state are taking seriously, because we just saw what happens when the independent candidate Dan Osborn was not really taken seriously by the Republicans. It ended up being a likely Republican race on similar levels of the states like Virginia, like New Jersey, states that maybe got a little more attention than Nebraska. These are likely Democratic states, and Nebraska was right there with them. So certainly very, very interesting. And one more interesting fact I just noticed, Nebraska voted more towards the middle in terms of the independent candidate than Texas did. Ted Cruz won the state of Texas by 8.5 points. Nebraska went 6.7 for Fisher over the independent. So it's just very interesting, but we're going to have to wait and see how this goes. I think it still stays as safe Republican for now, but something very, very interesting to watch for going forward in the coming months and weeks ahead. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to give it a like. Please remember to click subscribe. Share with your friends and family. Leave a comment below telling me your thoughts about this news. Do you think Osborn has a chance to win against Ricketts? How do you think he'll do? If he does not win in 2026, what do you think the margin of victory will be for Ricketts in that election? Also, make sure to click subscribe, as I post at least one new video every single day that you're not going to want to miss. That'll do it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. Hope to see you in a future video.